right, hello. It has been a little while since we have got to do a social studies lesson because it's been the weekend. And then on Fridays, we normally don't get to do one, so we want to have a quick refresher that we do have our AMRs out, that what they have in front of them already is where we had put in this towards the very beginning of when we made this AMR. So you already have a copy of this, but I'm going to go ahead and put another one just in case that we have done. Can't you make them behave, King George? And do you see that it says Katie's trunk? Have we read Katie's trunk? So could we fill this one out today too? Yeah, so before we get started, let's look at what it says. With Katie's trunk, what is the theme of this book? What is a Tory? What is a rebel? Do you remember reading that book? What was the theme? What did we talk about as Katie was actually a Tory and she had rebel soldiers come into her house? She hid inside of a trunk, and then someone who was a rebel soldier actually kind of snuck and made the other people think there was others coming and helped Katie be safe inside of the trunk. So what theme or lesson could be learned because of that book? Kinsley? Is that what we were talking about a lot last week? So just in case you couldn't hear Kinsley, people aren't always as they seem. That could be a theme. Is that the only one that would work? No, sometimes it's what you take away from the book. Is there anything else that you want to add for that one? Are we going to go with things aren't always as they seem? Because that's where we learned how originally we thought the rebels were like the good guys trying to help fight the bad guys of the British, but it was this time, it was the rebels who seemed to be doing unfair things. So that was a good one. And then it says, what's a Tory? What's a rebel? What's a Tory? Yeah, loyal to King George, a King George supporter. That sounded funny. Supporter. So underneath that flap, you could write that in there, that Tory. You could just do Tory equals supports King George, loyal to King George. And so then what would a rebel be? Not King George supporter. Excuse me, wanting their own freedom. They are the, rebels were the ones trying to create their own America. So if you were a rebel, you were a part of the, sorry, I had to think about how I was going to word that. If you were a rebel, you were against King George. That's what we could put instead. Makes it easier. Okay, and while you're writing, we're going to be looking at the one underneath that today. So it says, those rebels, John and Tom. So as we read, we're going to think about how did each man contribute, which means help or add to, the American independence? What's the text structure? So they can see that on the board, I have a picture of the book, and then here is the book right here. So you guys at the house will have a PDF version that you can follow along to, or you can simply just listen to the video, okay? So I think that y'all are done writing. This week, we're going to be talking a lot about that big, important document that was made that helped set us apart from Britain. Do you know what document I'm talking about, class? Yes, the Declaration of Independence. And that was the last thing that we had put in our AMR, where we said battles fought and independence was declared. So we're going to actually take this week to talk more about that, and this book is how we're going to start it. It is kind of a long story, especially for a Monday for us, but it's really important for us to get all of this information today because it's a 4-day week, and also what might happen this week. Snow. Either this week or next week, who knows, we might have snow. So we are going to read this whole book today, okay? So be prepared that you need to pay attention. You don't need to be tired. To help yourself stay awake, what can you do? All of you all of a sudden sat up straight. If you have anything for you to fidget with, what do you do? Stop. Put it away. Very good. Thank you. All right, so on the board you can see the cover. Those rebels, John and Tom. And then I've got Callie Kaylee, that sounded so funny, sorry. Kaylee helping with the board. Go ahead and scroll it down. That this is one of the cover pages inside. So just looking at that photo, what do you think? What do you notice? Two men speaking to each other. What do you notice about those two men? One of them looks like Thomas Jefferson, huh? Which one? The tall one or the short one? The tall one. So do you know who the short one is? It's got to be John, whoever John is. And somebody just said a name that they know from Who's Important. Which John? John Adams. Now, we've learned about him. What do we know about him already? Okay, but we don't know that. We haven't talked about that yet, but I'm glad you know that. What do we know from in here about John Adams? Remember, it's something that I said is important. You'll need to know it for your end of unit test. He was the leader of the Sons of Liberty. There we go. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and jump into reading, because as we read this, you need to see how did these two men contribute to America's independence, and then also how are these two men different yet alike. So, the true story of how one gentleman, short and stout, and another, tall and lean, formed a surprising alliance, committed treason, and helped launch a new nation. Treason is where you go against the king, against who's in charge. When John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were young, they were very different. Now, I know your picture's kind of small. Can you see that is, make sure I'm pointing to the right thing, a chest of drawers, and it says John, and then here he is bouncing away. And then here is a fancy little crib, and that is supposed to be Tom. So you already see some differences, right? Okay. John skipped school to fly kites and shoot marbles. He loved swimming, hunting, wrestling, and the occasional boxing match, just for kicks. Tom didn't skip school. He skipped recess to study grammar, Greek grammar. He loved dancing, playing the violin, and reading all the books in his father's library. Would you skip school or skip recess? When John and Tom grew up, they were even more different. John liked to talk and talk. In college, he joined a debating club so that he could talk some more. And when he became a lawyer, he found that he could talk for hours without using any notes, a handy skill in the courtroom. He loved nothing more than to battle wits in a lively argument. Tom was shy. He dreaded speaking in front of crowds. Talking too loudly made his voice hoarse. When he became a lawyer, he found that he didn't enjoy presenting cases to the jury, a bit of a problem in the courtroom. He hated arguments. If he had an idea, he quietly wrote it down. John lived in a sturdy farmhouse in Braintree, Massachusetts. He found farming very muddy, but he liked it very well, clearing stumps to plow his fields and then carting out manure to fertilize them. When he wasn't in the courtroom, he planted corn, pruned fruit trees, and chased his chickens and ducks. Tom leveled a mountain to build his estate on Monticello in Virginia. Architecture was one of his favorite amusements, calculating windows, walls, and wainscots to a 1/16 of an inch. When he wasn't in the courtroom, he maintained his accounts, surveyed his lands, and dined on chicken and duck. So just right here from the beginning, what are some things that you notice that are alike and different about Tom and John? Turn and talk real quick. Think to yourself already, what are you noticing about these two men? So John is the short one, Tom is the tall one.
Well, John, he's like talking a lot. He makes fun. He doesn't like other men.
Okay, so most of you started off very consistently about the same thing. So I'm going to point first. So the shorter one, is John. What's something that stands out about John? Emaya? He talks a lot. Now, if you agree, what would I like to hear? All right, just making sure we remember that. So why does he talk a lot? Let's add a little bit more to that. Caden?
He loves to talk.
He loves to talk, and how did that help him?
In the courtroom, he could talk without having to look at notes.
Yeah, so what can we infer if he was in the courtroom and he talked without notes? Is he just somebody in the audience talking out? What is he?
He's a good lawyer.
He's a lawyer. So right now he's a lawyer, not a judge, okay? So that let us know something about him. Now the tall one, who's that? Tom, okay? So that's Thomas Jefferson. What's something that stood out about him? Kimber?
He makes really good decisions
Why do you say that?
because, like, he's trying to do things that will help him when he gets older, like make sure he skips recess to make sure that he can practice Greek grammar, and he's also he never skipped school
but John did. Yeah. So making good decisions. Now, if he's doing that to learn about Greek grammar, how is that helping him in his future?
Spelling. Well, he did help write the Declaration of Independence.
So we know that from just prior knowledge, he did help write the Declaration of Independence. Now it does say that, oops, I almost ripped that page. Woo! It says that he hated arguments, and if he had an idea, he quietly wrote it down, and that didn't help him in the courtroom. So if he's in the courtroom too, what is he?
A lawyer.
He's also a lawyer. Okay, good. So when we talk about somebody who likes to talk out a lot and likes to go skip school to go do things in the yard, how would we describe that person? Could be hardworking because he was working in the fields. If you're somebody who answers out a lot, are you shy?
No.
No. So you would be, the word you could say is outgoing. Repeat that. So you have a little flap that is in the back. Sorry, I'm trying to turn to mine. Oh wait, mine's not in my book. That you have where it actually flaps open. So not on the inside where you write answers, on the actual flap, the back of it. Can you write down John? And then do like an equal sign. He's outgoing.
On this one?
Yes, ma'am. Just so that you remember that about him, that John Adams was an outgoing person. He liked to talk a lot. He liked to argue. He liked to go outside and work. That's an outgoing person. So you're just writing John equals outgoing. And so if we did that for John, what can we do for Tom? Hardworking, shy. Now, if we did outgoing, I heard somebody say ingoing because that kind of sounds like it would be an opposite, but ingoing's not the correct way to say it, but I appreciate you understood we were going to find an antonym. That something that's the opposite of outgoing would be shy, and I heard somebody say it, okay? Now, another word could be reserved. So if John liked to speak out in all of his arguments, but Tom likes to quietly think, he reserves himself. So you could put Tom equals shy equals, I'm about to spell reserved. You ready? R-E-S-E R-V-E-D. Reserved. So now you have two character traits for those two men. If I had you write it down, what can you infer? You're going to need to know that, okay? You're going to need to know it. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and get back into reading. On this page. Yep. John and Tom were indeed very different, but they did have two things in common. They both cared deeply about the American colonies, and neither of them cared much for George. George lived across the ocean in England, in a grand and glorious palace. He was the latest in a long line of kings who had ruled colonists in America. Some people called him Good King George. John and Tom called him a tyrant. George and his government took away Americans' right to a fair trial. They shut down public meetings. George's army occupied the city of Boston, and his navy patrolled the Atlantic Ocean from England clear to the Virginia coast. When John stayed in Boston for work, George's troops exercised early each morning, fifes squealing, feet stomping, and drums rat-a-tat-tatting. How was anyone supposed to sleep with a racket like that? When Tom sent his tobacco downriver to market, he could sell it to no country but England, whatever the price. How could anyone pay the bills with a racket like that? And then there were all those taxes. A tax on sugar, on coffee and tea, on glass, on paint, and on calico cloth. Newspapers, contracts, even deck of cards. King George and his government taxed them all. They thought America was nothing but a big fat piggy bank to be turned upside down and shaken for coins. And so, in the fall of 1774, a group of Americans planned a meeting in Philadelphia, a Continental Congress, to figure out what to do about it. Something had to change. Touch your nose if you've heard about this, because we highlighted it, right? Continental Congress. John kissed his family goodbye and proudly accepted a spot with the Massachusetts delegation. When he reached Philadelphia, he was struck by the neatly laid out streets and elegant buildings. And oh, the food! But when he met his fellow delegates, he fretted. Each man had his own character and temper, his own principles and views. Somehow, these 50 gentlemen, total strangers, would need to join forces. John thought the fledgling Congress a nursery of American statesmen. Could he and the other delegates learn how to unite the separate colonies in one single purpose? What did they notice with all of those men?
Different traits.
All different traits. Now, does that sound like they're going to be able to come together like we need them to? What do you think has to happen for them to be able to come together? They need to have the same views. What were you saying, Nathan? Accept each other. Okay, so kind of like find everybody's strengths. All right. Day after day, the delegates met to discuss their problems with George. Tedious indeed is our business, slow as snails, John wrote to his wife Abigail. Choosing a course of action would not be easy. Now, what do you notice about that picture? It's an actual snail, and who's on top of the snail? Sorry, let y'all see. Everyone except for, who's this? Yeah, that person right there is John. So he's kind of saying these people are being too slow. Because remember, what type of person is he? Outgoing. He's ready to get things rolling, and these other people are going real slow for him. So let's see how Tom feels about it. In the summer of 1775, Tom kissed his family goodbye and proudly rode into Philadelphia to join the Virginia delegation. He toured the museums and drank punch in the taverns, and oh, the shopping. He arrived already famous for a pamphlet he'd written calling King George a blot on the page of history. But as Tom took his seat in Congress, he quickly grew appalled. The delegates agreed on so little and argued so much. Would they ever reach a consensus on what to do? And how could Tom possibly make himself heard above all the noise? Does he feel the same as John? Were both of them appalled, meaning they couldn't stand what was going on with the other delegates, the other people? Yeah. As he took stock of the new delegate from Virginia, John, the son of a farmer and shoemaker from the north, couldn't help noticing that Tom was impeccably dressed and very soft-spoken, with gracious manners that pleased everyone. He was also quite tall. And Tom, the son of an aristocratic planter from the south, couldn't help noticing that John was plainly dressed and spoke rather bluntly, with a gruff manner that sometimes pleased almost no one. He was also rather short. What are the two men doing right there? Thinking about each other. It's called sizing each other up, which is kind of a funny phrase because aren't their sizes a lot different? Yeah, so they're trying to see what type of man is this. So, sorry, I can't read upside down. Nope, it's a different page. I almost got ahead of myself. Let's turn the page. Tom watched astounded as John battled hour after hour through heated debate, tapping the floor with his walking stick to hammer the words home. How could anyone love to argue so much? And John noted with astonishment that in Congress, Tom slumped down in his chair and never uttered 3 sentences together. How could anyone who cared that much about America sit silently by? And that's the page I wanted to talk about. What does John think of Tom?
He's boring. He's kind of
He's kind of what?
obnoxious.
Obnoxious? He thinks Tom is obnoxious?
No.
The other way around. So let's stick with Tom first, okay? So remember, I can't point to him. Here he is. Tom is over here. And it says that how could anyone who care about America sit silently? So what does John think about Tom? That he doesn't care, that he's being so quiet. And then now what does Tom think about John?
He's so loud, obnoxious, and I think everybody
Yeah, and so that's where Wyatt was saying obnoxious and Kinsley's adding in there. He's so loud and always wanting his voice out there. So do they feel like they would get along right now? Doesn't seem like it. They're so opposite. Have you ever heard the phrase opposites attract? Okay, so let's turn the page. Congress had just established a continental army to fight for colonist rights, and Tom had brought to Philadelphia a powerful weapon of his own, a pen, and the skill to use it better than almost any man in America. The delegates now turned to Tom and his mighty pen to justify why America was taking up arms. He lunged, parried, and skewered the policies of King George and his government. Now, can you see that? Which for you guys at home is this. That's supposed to be a weapon. Does this look like a weapon? What is that? How can his pen be a weapon? Ava?
He can like sign something and it can change everything.
So you probably couldn't hear her. She said he could sign something and it could change everything. Can you still use your words with a pen? Can your words be weapons? Yes. Can intelligence be a weapon? Definitely. Tom might be silent in Congress, John realized, but he wasn't afraid to answer King George with his pen. In fact, Tom was so prompt, frank, explicit, and decisive in private conversation that he soon seized upon John's heart. And John's constant arguing might annoy many of those in Congress, but underneath the bluster, Tom discovered, was a man so amiable, he later wrote a friend, that I pronounce you will love him if ever you become acquainted with him. And the two very different men sensed that working together, they might accomplish more than by working alone. Perhaps they could compel their fellow delegates to take action. How could these two men work well together?
He says the stuff and he likes.
Okay, I'm gonna let Hayden talk and then tag on to you.
The phrase you said is just opposites attract each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of saying that all these other people are saying all their opinions, and these two don't like it, so they're gonna try to come together and stop it. And like, stop, let us do it.
Stop, let us do it. So being able to unite in that way. And so then that matches what Kinsley was just saying, that, well, he's going to say the things, but then he's going to be able to write them. And that way it would come across even stronger to help all of those people unite as one. So let's see how they do it. I know I told you it was kind of a long book for today. So next page, we're almost through it, guys. Endless debate. They knew was no longer an option. King George's troops had already shot colonists in Lexington and Concord and burned Charleston to the ground. George now vowed to put a speedy end to the rebellion in the colonies and punish the rebels for treason. By 1776, John and Tom felt the time had come for America to break from King George and declare independence. But many delegates still had doubts. How could a small gathering of colonies square off against perhaps the mightiest country in the world? Now, how did this illustration prove they could be the mightiest country in the world? What stands out the biggest? What do you see? That carriage. What's that carriage supposed to be? A gold carriage carrying who? King George. Now, you might not be able to see it from your seat, but this right here, it actually says Great Britain. And then these are the ships coming from Great Britain, sent from King George. And then over here, so can y'all kind of see where ships have yellow coming from them? And then there's fires. So what is that supposed to be? Yeah, them shooting America. That's all of right there. So it's supposed to signify the war. And the biggest thing is supposed to be right there with King George. So they're saying, how can we get these people to come together to stop one of the greatest countries in the world? Stand up, Maddie. John and Tom knew that a united America depended on a unanimous vote. Could John's powers of persuasion and Tom's skill with the pen convince the naysayers to vote yay? If so, Congress would need to prepare a statement to the world explaining why America should be free. Who could write such a document? More than any other delegate in Congress, John had championed the cause of independence. You should do it, Tom told him. Oh, no, John exclaimed. Any declaration he wrote would be severely criticized. For some delegates, he conceded, found him obnoxious. The declaration should be written by a delegate from Virginia, the oldest and most powerful colony in America. More importantly, John told him, you can write 10 times better than I can. Well, Tom replied, if you are decided, I will do as well as I can. Touch your head if you already had that prior knowledge, because you were somebody who said it earlier. You knew that Tom wrote the Declaration of Independence. In the quiet of his rooms on Market Street, Tom worked on the Declaration of Independence, trying to craft an expression of the American mind in terms so plain and firm that people around the world would rally to America's side. He began with a statement of basic freedoms and ended with a long list of grievances against King George. One grievance Tom included was slavery, an issue he had struggled with for years. It was a cruel institution, Tom wrote, and George thwarted every attempt America made to prohibit it. And yet, like many men in Congress, Tom himself owned slaves. As he penned this document on freedom, his 14-year-old slave, Bob Hemmons, brought him tea. Hour after hour, Tom sat at his little desk, writing and thinking and writing some more. Meanwhile, John prepared himself for the greatest debate of all, the vote on independence. Storm clouds gathered as he stood and faced Congress. Above the crack of lightning and the boom of thunder, John spoke on, trying to convince the last naysayers to change their minds. From his place with the Virginia delegation, Tom marveled as John rallied the delegates. His power of thought and expression, Tom later wrote, moved us from our seats. What does that mean? I'm going to reread it because I think some of y'all might have got slightly lost there. Tom marveled as John rallied the delegates. His power of thought and expression, Tom later wrote, moved us from our seats. What does he mean by that? Madison?
I think it means when he was talking about the Declaration, everybody was like, it was like mind-blowing. They were like,
Yeah, move you from your seats. And so I did the little mind-blowing that his words were so good. He used the best precise words that it's what they were feeling inside, and maybe they couldn't put words to it. So when it said they moved them from their seat, Madison said like mind-blown. So it proves Tom is a very good writer. So then you can see that here they all are standing, saying yay. They all agree, standing up, good. Finally, the next morning, after almost 2 years of turmoil, a united America was ready to vote yay. The delegates now turned to Tom's declaration. He squirmed and suffered as they fine-tuned phrases and trimmed passages, including his condemnation of slavery, an issue the country would not resolve for almost 100 years. They cut and cut until soon Tom's work was only 1 page long, an expression in terms plain and firm of American independence. We solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and for the support of this declaration, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Have you heard that part before? What is that from? The Declaration of Independence. Now we, this week, are going to get to go through and read different pieces of the Declaration of Independence to have a better understanding of it. But now we're going to look, and you can see, what are those pictures up there? Fireworks. What does that make you think of?
July the 4th.
July the 4th. Okay, so July the 4th, does anybody remember the date? 1776, a very important date. In cities and towns, bells rang out as the Declaration was read aloud. Americans paraded, lit bonfires, and toasted farewell to England. In New York City, they even pulled down the statue of good King George. Throughout the states, the United States, Americans celebrated the end of British oppression. They savored the promise of a new future, and they cheered the group of men who left behind family and friends to meet in Philadelphia. Hancock, Lee, Sherman, Livingston, Franklin, Rush, Rodney, Harrison, and all the others who launched a new nation. This picture with those rebels, John and Tom. What's this picture of? The names, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. This is actually a picture from it. That's what the bottom portion looks like. Now, on the PDF at the house, I'm sorry this page isn't in there. It wouldn't let me add it, too many pages. But this is the actual picture of the Declaration of Independence. So we will be looking at that because you can see it's very small, the words are, but all of that, remember it said he had several pages and they had to trim it down to where it would be one page. And then these are all the men who were a part of the process and were there to sign our Declaration of Independence. What day was the Declaration of Independence signed? 1776. That's very important to know. This week, during your station time, you're actually going to be breaking apart pieces of the Declaration of Independence. We are about to answer this question in our booklet, that how did John, and Tom contribute to America's independence? And then I think it does ask about text structure too. So I'm going to let y'all turn and talk with your shoulder partner to answer that while I sign off for these kiddos, because I know this one's been a long video. So y'all go ahead and whisper talk. Sorry, this one was a little bit longer, but it's for just in case, trying to be prepared that we might be out this week. Don't know, probably not, we'll see. But we did have this book that we just read that you do have the flaps in your American Revolution booklet that you need to be answering that same question. So how did John and Tom contribute to America's independence? So remember, John was a very outgoing lawyer and Tom was a very shy, quiet scholar, somebody who liked to learn. So what are the two things you learned about them and how did they help contribute to America's independence? You'll be turning that in as an assignment today. And then you'll also see how to do your little booklet that you have to learn different things about the Declaration of Independence. And that's all for now. Bye.